This is Theodore, and tonight we are not tiptoeing around anything. We are stepping straight into the fire, because what is unfolding in the entertainment industry right now feels less like coincidence and more like coordination. A calculated wave of narrative management where timing, loyalty, fear, and business interests are all colliding in real time. And when you start to connect the dots, the picture becomes impossible to ignore, because multiple influential voices stepping forward at once to defend one embattled figure is rarely accidental. It is usually strategic. And that is exactly what people are questioning as the situation surrounding Sean Diddy Combs continues to escalate in both legal and public perception. Because let's be honest, in today's media climate, controlling the narrative is almost as important as controlling the outcome. And when reputations worth billions are on the line, silence is not an option. Response is mandatory. But the way that response is delivered is what tells the real story. And that's where things start to feel orchestrated rather than organic. Because suddenly you have a series of high-profile figures stepping in not to question, not to distance themselves, but to defend, to soften, to reframe. And when that happens all at once, people naturally start asking who benefits and why now. And that brings us directly to the first major voice in this unfolding drama, J. Cole, whose involvement carries weight not just because of his status, but because of his history with Diddy. A history that includes a physical altercation serious enough that it was documented, filmed, and nearly released, and yet he chose to hold it back, not because it lacked relevance, not because it didn't happen, but because he felt releasing it during Diddy's current troubles would be like kicking a man when he is down. And on the surface, that sounds like restraint, even maturity. But beneath that decision lies a deeper tension that audiences are picking up on, because the same restraint being exercised now was not necessarily extended in the past, and that inconsistency is where the criticism begins, because people are not just looking at what is being said, they are looking at what is being withheld. And in a moment where information shapes perception, withholding becomes a form of influence, whether intentional or not. Because when someone with first-hand experience chooses silence during a critical moment, it alters the narrative landscape, it limits the full scope of understanding, and in doing so, it indirectly protects more than just an individual. It protects a brand, a legacy, and possibly an entire network of relationships that extend far beyond what the public can see. And that is where the conversation shifts from personal choice to public impact. Because in an industry built on visibility, silence is never neutral. It is strategic, even if it is framed as compassion. And that same pattern of carefully framed defense continues when you look at Young Miami, whose response leans heavily on personal experience, describing a relationship where she felt supported, valued, and uplifted. And that perspective is valid, it is real, it is hers, but it is also limited. Because personal experience does not cancel out broader allegations, it exists alongside them. And that distinction is critical, because someone can be one thing in private to one person and something entirely different to others, and both realities can coexist without contradiction. And when public figures speak from personal loyalty during a crisis, it often reflects emotional truth more than objective reality. And that is not inherently wrong, but it does shape how the public interprets their statements, especially when those statements emerge at a time when public opinion is shifting rapidly. Because timing, again, becomes the silent factor driving perception. And when multiple voices align in timing, if not in wording, it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like coordination. And that perception only intensifies when you bring Usher into the conversation, because his defense has sparked one of the strongest reactions due to the apparent contradiction between his current stance and his past remarks, where he has previously alluded to negative experiences connected to Diddy, including long-term impacts that suggest deeper issues beneath the surface. And now, to see a shift toward a more neutral or even protective tone raises questions about why the narrative has changed, because people remember what was said before, and when those earlier statements don't align with current ones, it creates a credibility gap that audiences are quick to notice. And that gap invites speculation, not just about individual statements, but about the broader environment influencing those statements. Because in an industry where relationships, leverage, and information are currency, public messaging is rarely free from influence, and that is where the conversation expands beyond individual defenses and into the realm of collective strategy. Because whether intentional or not, the result is the same, a softening of public perception at a critical moment. And that leads directly into another major figure, navigating his own wave of scrutiny, Jay-Z, who has also been engaged in what many perceive as his own form of damage control, particularly through a high-profile interview where he addressed past allegations, business practices, and his perspective on the culture. And while he denied taking advantage of others, asserting that his success was not built on exploitation, that claim has been met with skepticism by critics who point to various moments in his career where others appeared to benefit less from deals or partnerships, including references to early business relationships, industry decisions, and high-stakes agreements that shaped not only his trajectory, but the trajectories of those around him. And again, this is where perception becomes more powerful than any single statement, because in the court of public opinion, consistency matters more than intent, and when people can point to patterns, whether fully accurate or not, those patterns begin to define the narrative. And Jay-Z's situation becomes even more layered when you consider his comments on the evolving nature of rap culture, particularly his suggestion that battle rap may no longer be necessary due to the negativity it generates, a stance that has sparked debate given his own history within a culture where conflict was not just accepted, but celebrated as a form of artistic expression. And critics are quick to highlight the irony, pointing to past lyrics and moments where personal lines were crossed in the name of competition, making the current call for restraint feel inconsistent to some. And that inconsistency fuels the perception that the statement may be less about cultural concern and more about shifting the narrative at a time when industry dynamics are changing, especially in light of the highly publicized conflict between Kendrick Lamar and Drake, a clash that has not only dominated headlines but also raised questions about the role of industry influence in shaping outcomes. Because while the battle itself may have been rooted in artistic rivalry, the scale of its amplification suggests involvement beyond the artists alone. With corporate backing, platform promotion, and strategic positioning all playing a role in how the narrative unfolded. And when you start to examine the business connections, the partnerships, and the financial interests tied to those involved, it becomes clear that the stakes extend far beyond music. Because in this industry, influence is interconnected, and decisions made at the top ripple outward, affecting not just careers, but entire segments of the market. And that is why some observers believe that what appeared to be a straightforward artistic battle may also have served broader strategic interests, whether that was the intention from the beginning or the result of how events unfolded. And when you factor in reports of legal proceedings where unrelated figures were brought into questioning, it adds another layer of complexity that further blurs the line between coincidence and strategy. Because when names repeatedly surface in contexts where they do not directly belong, it raises legitimate questions about underlying motives and long-term positioning.
And all of this feeds into a larger narrative that the industry is not just reacting to events, but actively shaping them, guiding public perception through carefully timed statements, selective disclosures, and coordinated messaging. And whether or not every piece of that narrative is accurate, the perception itself carries weight, because in the modern media landscape, perception drives engagement, engagement drives conversation, and conversation ultimately shapes reality. And that's why moments like this matter, because they reveal not just what is happening on the surface, but how the machinery behind the scenes operates, how alliances form, how narratives shift, and how power is exercised not through direct control, but through influence, through suggestion, through the subtle alignment of voices at just the right moment. And as all of this continues to unfold, one thing becomes clear. This is not just about individual reputations. This is about an entire ecosystem responding to pressure, adapting in real time, and doing everything it can to maintain balance in a landscape where one major shift can change everything. And whether the public accepts these narratives or challenges them will ultimately determine how this chapter ends.